30 nations signed on to protect the Strait of Hormuz. When the moment arrived, 28 of them found reasons to be somewhere else. Which two nations made the quiet moves that left Washington exposed, and why did both do it on the same day? What did Iran offer those nations privately that the U.S. couldn't match publicly? The official name is Operation Prosperity Guardian, launched in December 2023 with considerable fanfare, backed by a State Department press release that listed participant nations in bold, described by the Secretary of Defense as the most significant maritime coalition since the Gulf War, 30 nations, combined naval tonnage. That dwarfs anything Iran could put to sea, a command structure headquartered at Fifth Fleet in Manama, Bahrain, with real-time intelligence sharing and coordinated rules of engagement. On paper, the most formidable maritime security architecture ever assembled for a single choke point. What that press release didn't mention, what no one in the official communications architecture was willing to say is that 14 of those 30 nations explicitly refused to contribute any naval assets. They contributed their name, their logo on the coalition letterhead, nothing else. And that was December 2023. It's gotten significantly worse since. Which two nations made the quiet moves that left Washington exposed, and why did both do it on the same day? What did Iran offer those nations privately that the U.S. couldn't match publicly? And why does the coalition's collapse matter more than any Iranian military action, and what does it unlock that Tehran has been waiting for years to attempt? Here is the board. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The Bab-el-Mandeb at the southern end of the Red Sea is 18 miles wide. Between these two choke points runs the most critical energy corridor on the planet, the route through which 20% of global oil and 8% of global liquefied natural gas moves every single day. Protecting that corridor was supposed to be the coalition's core function. But a coalition that exists on a press release and not on the water is not a coalition. It is a list, and Iran has known, for longer than Washington has been willing to admit, exactly how short the distance is between that list and an actual naval presence. Capable of deterring action. Two nations, two quiet moves, one day, and the distance collapsed entirely. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Operation Prosperity Guardian actually was beneath its public architecture. The 30-nation figure was always a construct, a number designed to project multilateral legitimacy at a moment when unilateral American action in the Gulf was politically untenable domestically and diplomatically costly internationally. The actual operational core of the coalition was never 30 nations. It was 5. The United States, the United Kingdom, Bahrain, Seychelles, and Canada formed the functional naval backbone, the vessels that were actually in the water, actually running escort operations, actually responding to Houthi drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping. The other 25 existed in varying degrees of political commitment, from nations that quietly contributed liaison officers to nations that contributed nothing beyond a diplomatic nod at a briefing in Brussels. 5 nations running a 30-nation coalition against a Houthi force that has, since October 2023, attacked more than 100 commercial vessels, forced global shipping companies to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 days and $1 million per voyage to container routes, and demonstrated a missile and drone inventory that has proven capable of defeating point defense systems on some of the most advanced warships afloat. 5 against a proxy that has effectively closed the world's second most important shipping lane. And the coalition was already under that kind of pressure before the two quiet moves happened. The United Kingdom's withdrawal came first, not announced, not framed as a withdrawal, framed as a reallocation of naval assets to meet updated NATO commitments in the North Atlantic. HMS Diamond, the Type 45 destroyer that had been the coalition's single most capable air defense asset in the Red Sea, the ship responsible for shooting down more Houthi drones than any other vessel in the coalition, was recalled to Portsmouth in a movement that the Royal Navy described as routine rotation. The replacement vessel was not a Type 45. It was a Type 23 frigate with significantly reduced air defense capability, and it arrived 23 days after the Diamond left, 23 days during which the coalition's air defense coverage over the southern Red Sea had a gap that any competent operational planner could see from a satellite imagery analysis. Iran's operational planners are competent. The second move was Canada's. Less dramatic in military terms, Canada's HMCS Montreal had been contributing to coalition operations but was not a primary air defense asset. What the Montreal's withdrawal represented was something more significant than its individual capability. It was the second G7 nation to exit the operational coalition within a 30-day window, and in the language of diplomatic signaling, which is the language Tehran reads more carefully than any military analysis, to G7 nations leaving within 30 days is not a coincidence. It is a trend line. It is evidence that the political cost of coalition participation is beginning to exceed the political cost of coalition exit, and once that calculation tips for two nations, it tips for others fast. What made the political cost of staying suddenly exceed the cost of leaving, and who was applying that pressure? The answer begins not in London or Ottawa, but in a series of diplomatic contacts that ran through three intermediary capitals between September and November of last year. The contacts were not publicized. They were not conducted through normal foreign ministry channels. They ran through trade ministries, specifically through trade. Officials in nations that have significant economic exposure to Iranian energy and Iranian market access. The message delivered through those contacts was consistent across all three intermediary capitals and has been reconstructed through reporting by a small number of specialist defense publications that cover Gulf security without the constraint of needing White House access for their next story. The message was this: nations that maintain active naval participation in Operation Prosperity Guardian will be excluded from the post-sanctions Iranian energy market when not if sanctions relief comes. Nations that find reasons to reduce or exit their coalition participation will be remembered favorably when that market opens. Post-sanctions Iranian energy market. Let's quantify what that phrase actually means to a nation making a calculation about whether to keep a frigate in the Red Sea. Iran holds the world's second largest natural gas reserves and the fourth largest proven oil reserves. A fully sanctions-lifted Iranian energy market represents, by conservative IMF estimates, a $400 billion economic opportunity over the first decade of open access for nations with significant energy import dependence, and most of the coalition's peripheral members have exactly that exposure. $400 billion in future access is a number that makes the cost of a frigate deployment look like a rounding error. Iran didn't threaten anyone. It didn't issue ultimatums. It offered a future, a specific, quantified, economically rational future delivered quietly through trade channels that leave no diplomatic fingerprints and create no incident that requires a public response. This is the sophistication that the framing of Iran as a rogue, irrational actor consistently fails to account for. The withdrawal of HMS Diamond and HMCS Montreal was not caused by Iranian military pressure. It was caused by Iranian economic diplomacy, executed through intermediaries over months at zero military cost, maximum strategic effect. Which nation is next, and how close is the coalition's functional core to becoming a coalition of one? Here is the piece that reframes the entire coalition collapse and connects it to something much larger than shipping lane security. Bahrain, the Fifth Fleet's host nation, the physical location of the coalition's command headquarters. The nation whose territorial waters contain the infrastructure, the logistics support, the fuel and ammunition supply chains that make us naval operations in the Gulf operationally sustainable. Bahrain has been a party to the same diplomatic contacts that preceded the British and Canadian withdrawals. Not as a recipient of Iran's post-sanctions market offer. Bahrain's relationship with Iran is too hostile, too historically freighted, for that channel to function, but as a subject of a different kind of pressure entirely. A pressure that operates not through economic incentive, but through the 70% of Bahrain's population that is Shia Muslim, many of whom maintain cultural and religious connections to Iran, and all of whom live under a Sunni monarchy that has suppressed significant domestic unrest with American and Saudi backing since 2011. Bahrain's government is not going to withdraw from the coalition, but Bahrain's government has, in the last 6 months, begun quietly restricting the operational permissions it grants to us forces using Fifth Fleet facilities. Not publicly, not in any way that generates a diplomatic incident. Small things, maintenance window extensions that require additional approval steps, fuel resupply authorizations that now route through an additional ministry, intelligence sharing protocols that have developed new friction points at the bureaucratic level, none of it individually significant. Collectively, it represents a 15 to 20% degradation in the operational tempo that Fifth Fleet can sustain from Manama. 15 to 20% operational tempo degradation at the coalition's command headquarters, while the coalition's two most capable air defense assets have exited the Red Sea theater, while the post-sanctions diplomatic pressure continues to run through trade ministry channels across the coalition's peripheral members, while Iran has not fired a single shot to achieve any of it. Watch this closely, because what is being dismantled is not the coalition's military capability. What is being dismantled is the political architecture that makes American military presence in the Gulf legitimate in the eyes of the regional states that host it, and without that legitimacy. Without the willing cooperation of host nations, the most capable naval force in human history becomes a fleet that can project power but cannot sustain it, cannot fuel it, cannot maintain it, cannot base it. The distinction between power projection and power sustainment is the hinge on which this entire strategic situation turns. The U.S. can surge 3 carriers into the Gulf. It demonstrated that, but surging and sustaining are different operations. A surge is weeks. Sustainment is months, years, the long-term presence that constitutes actual deterrence rather than a dramatic but temporary show of force. Sustainment requires bases. Bases require host nation agreements. Host nation agreements require political will, and political will is exactly what Iran's diplomatic campaign run through trade ministries, denominated in $400 billion future market access. Executed without a single military action is systematically eroding. 3 nations are currently in the final stages of the same diplomatic contact sequence that preceded the British and Canadian withdrawals. Their identities are not confirmed in open-source reporting, but their profiles are inferable from the coalition membership list cross-referenced against energy import dependence data and current bilateral trade volumes with Iran's primary intermediary partners. They are mid-sized European nations with significant LNG import exposure. They joined the coalition in December 2023 for the same reason most peripheral members joined diplomatic alignment with Washington at a moment when the cost of non-participation seemed higher than the cost of participation. That calculation is reversing simultaneously in 3 capitals. When those 3 nations exit and the trajectory of the diplomatic contact suggests exit rather than continuation, the coalition's public membership drops from 30 to 25. That number will be reported as 25. What it will actually represent is a functional core of 3, because the UK's reduced capability replacement and Canada's exit have already shrunk the operational backbone below the threshold required to run continuous escort operations across both the Bab-el-Mandeb and the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously. You cannot escort traffic through 2 choke points 1,800 miles apart with 3 nations' worth of naval assets. The math does not work, and Iran's planners did the math before they made the first diplomatic contact. Here is the escalation that the coalition's collapse enables, the thing that the military coverage misses because it is looking at ships and missiles rather than political architecture. When the coalition shrinks to a functional core of 3, the United States faces a binary, except a degraded, understaffed security presence that cannot actually protect shipping through both choke points, or escalate to a unilateral American operation that abandons the multilateral framing entirely. Option 1 signals weakness. Option to a unilateral American naval operation explicitly protecting global shipping in a contested zone is the single most useful political gift Washington could hand to every nation currently considering whether to align more closely with the Beijing-Moscow-Tehran axis. It validates the narrative that American power is not a multilateral stabilizing force but a unilateral imperial one, and that narrative in the global South capitals where alignment decisions are being made right now is worth more to Iran's strategic position than 100 drone strikes. This is the trap. The coalition was never primarily a military construct. It was a legitimacy construct, a mechanism for framing American naval power as the expression of a global consensus rather than the expression of American national interest. Iran's campaign against it is not a military campaign. It is a legitimacy campaign. And it is winning, not because Iran is stronger than the coalition militarily, because Iran identified what the coalition actually was, found the load-bearing political architecture underneath the military structure, and has been dismantling that architecture quietly through trade ministry channels denominated in future market access. While the world watches the drone strikes and the carrier movements and misses the real operation entirely. Here's the full picture. 30 nations promised to guard Hormuz. 28 found reasons to be elsewhere because Iran made the political cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving, not through military pressure, not through threats, but through a $400 billion future market offer delivered through intermediaries who left no diplomatic fingerprints. HMS Diamond left a 23-day air defense gap. AMCS Montreal's exit signaled a G7 trend line. Bahrain's bureaucratic friction is degrading Fifth Fleet's operational tempo by 15 to 20%. and 3 more coalition members are in the final stages of the same exit sequence. That will reduce the operational backbone to 3 nations trying to simultaneously escort traffic through 2 choke points 1,800 miles apart. Which 2 nations made the quiet moves that left Washington exposed? The United Kingdom and Canada, not under military pressure, under economic diplomacy so precisely calibrated that neither exit required a public statement, a diplomatic incident, or a single Iranian military action to achieve. What did Iran offer those nations privately that the U.S. couldn't match publicly? The future, specifically $400 billion in post-sanctions energy market access, a number the U.S. cannot match, because matching it would require lifting the sanctions whose threat is the only non-military leverage Washington currently holds over Tehran, which leaves the third loop still open. Why does the coalition's collapse matter more than any Iranian military action, and what does it unlock that Tehran has been waiting for years to attempt? The answer to that question is not about the Strait of Hormuz. It is not about the Red Sea. It is about a specific vote scheduled in the UN Security Council in the next 90 days, a vote on the mechanism that allows the U.S. to reimpose multilateral sanctions on Iran without a Security Council majority. That mechanism, called snapback, expires, and the coalition's collapse is not separate from the snapback timeline. It is coordinated with it. The nations exiting the coalition are the same nations whose votes on snapback extension Iran has been courting through the same trade ministry channels. When you understand that, the entire 18-month diplomatic campaign resolves into a single, unified strategic operation, one that uses shipping security as the visible battlefield while the real fight happens in a conference room in New York. That story, and what it means for every calculation that follows, is where this goes next.